1968 was a tragic year for America. As America's foreign affairs in Vietnam grew increasingly violent and publicized, so did the domestic protests for civil rights. Then, in the midst of all this turmoil, arguably the most influential civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated. And soon after, in that same summer, Robert Kennedy, who was running for office and Attorney General at the time, was also assassinated. Before we dive into Nixon, I would like to point out that the natural pattern of Americans is that the population usually sways between the two popular opposite ideologies represented by the elected presidents that you'll see. So that means Republicans are usually followed by Democrats, followed by Republican, etc. for the most part. Nixon was a Republican who ran for office in 1968 with the promise of ending the Vietnam War, whose win can partially be attributed to the disastrous result of violent protests at the Democratic Convention opposing him. Nixon was sworn in 1969 as the 37th president and started to take out troops in Vietnam, but increased bombing in the north and Cambodia. Nixon can debatably be responsible for protracting the war for 2 more years after criticizing Lyndon Johnson's peace talks with the South Vietnamese, urging them to wait for a better settlement. In those 2 years, 20,000 more U.S. troops died in Vietnam. During this time, Nixon was also dealing with a huge export trade deficit due to the continued U.S. financial support of rapidly growing economies like Japan and Germany. He dealt with this by taking the U.S. off the gold standard to make American goods cheaper, which essentially failed. Nixon also started U.S. relations with China and was the first U.S. president to visit the communist nation while creating economic ties that are still held today. He was also able to achieve peace with the Soviet Union and strengthen relations. Nixon also created the Environmental Protection Agency and signed the National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, and Marine Mammal Protection Act into law. Nixon also signed the Title IX Amendment, which banned gender-based discrimination by colleges and education and helped peacefully procure the desegregation of schools. In another helpful act for students, he lowered the voting age to 18 in the midst of the civil rights movement and widespread protests against the Vietnam War. He also proposed a concept that is still considered progressive today, of guaranteed basic income for all American families, and urged health care reform as well. The Watergate investigation started near the end of his first term, when Nixon denied that his employees broke into the Democratic National Committee's meeting in the Watergate Hotel to spy on his Democratic rivals. Although he won his re-election, he soon resigned in an effort to not have the entirety of his crimes and public lies exposed in 1974. Nixon's scandal still leaves a bitter taste with Americans, making it harder for the public to trust in the government to this day. Nixon's Vice President Gerald Ford took office in 1974 as the 38th president, pardoned Nixon of his crimes, a very unpopular decision. Ford at this time was facing a lot of domestic economic troubles, with American manufacturing on a rapid decline, causing urban cities many issues, even leading New York City to almost go bankrupt in 1975. On top of all of this, Middle Eastern countries suspended their oil exports to the U.S. because of the U.S.'s support of Israel. Oil prices became 4 times as expensive, which led to many energy issues. During the 70s, inflation grew to 10% a year, and economic growth slowed. In response, Gerald Ford proposed WIN, a program to try to lessen inflation by essentially trying to urge Americans to spend less. Inflation did drop a bit, but unemployment also went up to 9%. Gerald Ford doesn't really do much else because a lot of his efforts to reduce taxes were shut down by opposing Democrats, although he was the first president to get made fun of on SNL. However, his inability to properly handle increasing inflation and the economic crisis at hand affected America throughout the 70s. Jimmy Carter, often known as the nicest president to take office in 1977, running as a more central Democrat. Off the bat, he faced economic issues with inflation. Then, in 1979, due to the Iranian Revolution, another spike in oil prices hit the U.S. Carter tried to fight the massive stagflation issue that was present by cutting down government spending. He deregulated the transportation and shipping industries and helped raise interest rates. These attempts still did not improve the economic crisis much, and it continued throughout his time in office. Carter left a lasting liberal impression on the Democratic Party. He supported energy conservation and supported nuclear power with heavy backlash after the 1979 Three Mile Island incident. Carter's lasting legacy, however, was unfortunately with the American public at the time being quite discontent with him after he urged Americans to conserve energy in the midst of the energy crisis, essentially saying to do more with less. This did not get him reelected. However, while all these domestic turmoils were happening, he did have much success in foreign policy, making human rights a priority and giving support to third world countries to combat poverty, and took a heavy anti-nuclear weapons stance. Carter cut off U.S. aid to the Argentinian dictatorship and gave Panama back the Panama Canal in 1978. He also procured the Camp David Accords, making a big leap in terms of more peaceful relations between Israel and Egypt. Carter also made the Carter Doctrines, which stated that the U.S. would use force to protect its interest in the Persian Gulf after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and boycotted the Moscow 1988 Olympics. However, while he did have these foreign triumphs that are still positively affecting foreign relations to date, there were also failures and mistakes. During this time, the U.S. still backed dictatorships in Nicaragua, the Philippines, and most notably Carter's support of the U.S. oil contributor and arms buyer, the unpopular Iranian Shah, resulting in the hostage situation of 53 Americans in the Tehran embassy, known as the Iranian hostage crisis, which lasted 444 days. The hostages were released right when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Ultimately, Jimmy Carter's term left a lasting impression on the public that his liberal policies were not successful for America, which led to the appeal of Reagan's conservative values. Ronald Reagan's presidency, deemed the Reagan Revolution, lasted from 1981 to 1989. Reagan won as a Republican with many conservative values. Reagan had the support of many religious conservatives and opposed affirmative action. Reagan appealed to conservatives such as the white backlash who resented African Americans for their progress and Cold War supporters who supported his extreme anti-Soviet efforts. A big part of his presidency was his economic tactics. He got Congress to lower top income taxes from 70 to 50%, and in 1986 is credited with helping pass the Tax Reform Act, lowering the top income tax even further to 28%. His economic strategy is called trickle-down economics, which believes that supporting the rich will help stimulate the economy and improve wages. In reality, wages did not increase and the lower income class didn't seem to get that money. By the mid-90s, the richest 1% controlled over 40% of the nation's wealth. The 80s were generally a prosperous time for Wall Street. Reagan cut funding for food stamps, mental health facilities, and school lunches. Reagan also appointed the first woman to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. Reagan also came up with the Star Wars program, a technologically impossible program that would theoretically shoot lasers at Soviet missiles in the sky, violating multiple international agreements. In 1983, he also urged NATO to at least pretend to have stationed missiles in Eastern Europe, which almost triggered the Soviets to launch nuclear weapons at Europe. However, this did result in a surge of support for the anti-nuclear weapons movement, FREEZE. Reagan is also credited with ending the Cold War and telling Mr. Gorbachev to tear down that wall in Germany. However, he did this by drastically ramping up the defense budget, so the Soviet Union eventually ended up essentially bankrupting itself in an effort to rival the US. Reagan spent more than the cost of the Vietnam and Korean Wars combined on defense. Another notable act of his presidency was the Iran-Contra scandal, where he is credited with illegally selling weapons to Iran and then funneling that money back to the Nicaraguan anti-communist group called the Contras. He did all of this to try to undermine Congress, but Congress found out, but he denied any knowledge of it, pinning it on two of his employees. Ultimately, Reagan's trickle-down economic tactic left his vice president, George H.W. Bush, to try to deal with the huge budget deficit that the government was trying to deal with. However, that did not stop George H.W. Bush from running as a sort of new conservative that was trying to bring a whole new image and fresh way of thinking to the Republican Party, while still trying to appear as part of the well-functioning Reagan coalition image. Even before he was elected in 1989, he had already served as the vice president for 8 years, was the director of the CIA, had made millions in tech and oil, was an ambassador to the UN, and had become the youngest and most distinguished Navy pilot. In an effort to emphasize his new approach to being a practical Republican with conservative policies, Bush brought a new approach in being a Republican with his famous saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes."
Read my lips.
George H.W. Bush campaigned an entirely new embodiment of a Republican, with his notable campaign promise of no new taxes, but because of the state of the economy, he was left with no other choice but to raise taxes, and his approval ratings dramatically dropped for the rest of his term. However, before all of that, in the beginning of his term, Bush didn't really focus on these domestic issues and was wrapped up in foreign affairs. He helped unify Germany, and the Cold War officially ended. In 1991, START, or the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, were implemented to reduce nuclear missiles in the Soviet Union and the US. That same year, Bush also invaded Iraq with ease, because the end of the Cold War left the US with an excess of military resources. Iraq was still a success and drove out Saddam Hussein. His approval rating skyrocketed because of this until he had to raise taxes. He also passed the Disabilities Act, Immigration Act, and Clean Air Act. There was also a huge recession where unemployment rose to 7% and taxes had to be raised. Bush did not have much of a chance in the re-election due to this and a successful third-party nominee, Ross Perot. Bush moved to be a more moderate Republican but lost to Clinton, so ever since the Republican Party has grown more and more conservative. Bill Clinton was sworn in 1993 as a sort of New Age Democrat and lasted until 2001. He brought a fresher image to the Democratic Party, the legacy of which still stands today. In 1993, Clinton is credited with the success of the Oslo Accords, when Israel recognized the legitimacy of the Palestinians. Clinton also ended the mass slaughter of Yugo-Muslims in Yugoslavia with NATO with the Dayton Accords. However, the Rwandan genocide still did occur, and the international community did almost nothing, and almost 500,000 people died in just a few months. Domestic terrorism was also a big issue in his presidency, with 2 Americans blowing up the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Clinton also tried to terminate the ban on gay people entering the military, but there was so much opposition that he had to settle on the don't ask, don't tell policy. Hillary Clinton during this period also proposed universal health care, but was met with lots of backlash from the private healthcare sector. In 1995, the proposal of a new, very conservative Republican campaign led to a government shutdown. Clinton advertised himself as a pro-small government central Democrat and passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996. His landmark economic policy was welfare reform, where instead of financial support being given directly to low-income mothers, he gave states a budget that added on many requirements for this financial support. The Clintons maintained their popularity throughout the term, and by the time he left office, unemployment was below 4%. During this time, the e-commerce boom took off with the implementation of computer chips into different consumer products, along with the creation of NAFTA, and the taxing of upper income class increased. There was also a great influx of immigration, but also the AIDS epidemic and a great influx of convicted Americans that rose to an all-time high, the implementation of acts like the Three Strike Laws and the active domestic war on drugs. Clinton is most notably known for the infamous sex scandal in which he lied under oath about having sexual relations with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
He was charged with perjury for these lies but was acquitted by Congress in 1999 and continued his term until 2001. George W. Bush's controversy started immediately, with the skeptical American public questioning the entire process of the year 2000 election that got him elected over Al Gore. Although he lost the popular vote, he won the Electoral College votes. Bush ran as a conservative Republican and was sworn in 2001. He proposed a missile defense system similar to Reagan's Star Wars program, prohibited federal funding of stem cell research, and supported oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The Bush administration also purposefully ignored the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, limiting carbon emissions, causing much backlash domestically with environmentalists. Bush also enacted the No Child Left Behind Act, which required testing to ensure a certain level of education, and also very controversial. Similar to Reagan, Bush also cut taxes and supported a trickle-down economy. This was during the midst of a recession, but in September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked the World Trade Center. In response, Bush made the Bush Doctrine, declaring war on the countries that harbored terrorists in the Middle East. U.S. troops were sent into Afghanistan, and soon after, Bush extended the war to Iran and Iraq. America was now at war with any society which the U.S. deemed did not have a democracy, free market, or religious freedom. In 2003, American troops took out the socialist government led by Saddam Hussein, and the country dissolved into civil unrest and chaos, welcoming many foreign terrorist groups in. By 2006, 3,000 American troops died in Iraq, and the cost of the war grew to $200 billion. Bush also enacted the USA Patriot Act, which gave the government power to spy using wiretaps and surveillance in an effort to combat domestic terrorism. Along with this, over 1,200 Americans were held in jail for months without any charges. Guantanamo Bay was also set up in Cuba as a prison for terrorist suspects. Torture became banned on the federal level, but enhanced interrogation like waterboarding was passed. Bush's even more controversial second term left him with the lowest approval rating ever, and the country with a massive recession due to the collapse of the housing market and the banking industry. In 2009, Obama became the first African American president and immediately had to face the major recession. Due to low interest rates,
and loans, letting people buy up the housing market, trusting in its profit, combined with the halt of banks giving out loans to citizens and businesses, along with a decade of consumer overspending, caused the stock market to plummet and the GDP to go down by 6%. By the time Obama came into office, the recession had already forced the loss of over 2.5 million American manufacturing jobs, primarily held by men. Because of this, just a few months into his term, more women held jobs than men for the first time in American history. In response to the recession, Obama enacted the Recovery Act and almost $800 billion of financial support to businesses. Obama signed the Fair Pay Act, giving women the ability to sue in response to systematic unfair pay, and appointed the Supreme Court's first Hispanic justice, Sonia Sotomayor. He also ended the war in Iraq and sent more troops to Afghanistan in an effort to end the war there, and authorized a successful mission to kill Osama bin Laden. In domestic policy, Obama most notably started Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, to help those who can't afford private health insurance with financial support. He also helped officially legalize same-sex marriage and created new climate regulations. However, in his second term, he is widely known for the lack of policies that ended up passing because of the highly divided Congress at the time, that essentially didn't let anything get passed. His term ended in 2017, and then Trump.
Presidents still stay active in politics even after their term. In fact, some say that Jimmy Carter has been a better politician after his presidential term. Even at 94, he still stays politically active.
Going on 94, yeah.
Going on 90. Do you speak to the other ex-presidents
Oh, sure.
ever?
In fact, I'll be with two of them tomorrow.
Oh, who?
With George W. Bush and with Bill Clinton.
Okay. Now, do all the ex-presidents feel kind of good that since Trump's in office, all of you have gone up the ranks one notch?
It is very common for a president to take a sort of break after their presidency, but depending on the person, a lot do remain politically active, publishing books, still giving speeches, helping other politicians with endorsements, and making celebrity-like appearances along with philanthropy work.